Well, I'm glad you asked the easy question first. That's going to take a lot of time to answer. Earlier today, both the Iranian and the American representatives connected with the anticipated meeting tomorrow in Islamabad have stated categorically that neither side wants an extension in the ceasefire. That means that neither Americans nor Iranians are preparing to uh, extend the ceasefire beyond Monday. Monday is presumably the terminal point. So, having said that, what are we looking at? Let me back up a little bit and talk about some things that may or may not come up for discussion in other settings. The first is this thing called the energy complex. I call it the energy complex because it's about energy around the world. What we've witnessed is the sort of collapse of the energy providing system on a global basis, all because roughly 15 million, some people say more, but at least 15 million barrels of oil a day have been taken off the market. Some people say it's 20. It depends on how far back you want to go, but certainly before this war started, 15 million is a pretty accurate number. Now, what does this mean? It means much more than what we traditionally associate with energy. Right now, 35% of the global fertilizer market is gone. That means 35% of the fertilizer that the world is accustomed to using is no longer available, and it's not likely to come back online for some period of time. Even if the war ended tomorrow, it'll be some time before the fertilizer could arrive and make any difference to future crops. The problem with this is that we certainly are facing famine in the near term in many areas of the global south. We'll certainly see food rationing in places like Europe, potentially even in Japan, Korea. We'll have to wait and see. But the bottom line is when 35% of your available fertilizer is gone, you're effectively reversing the green revolution. Most people today take the green revolution for granted. This is something that came about after the Second World War that sparked the growth in populations all over the world. Suddenly, instead of dying off early or not having sufficient numbers of children, particularly in the global south, the population exploded because it could be fed, it could be nurtured. That's about to end, at least in the short term. Now, what's long term mean? Well, I just listened to an economist who insisted that if this war were to terminate within the next few weeks, maybe the next 2 weeks, it might be anywhere from 2 to 3 years before we would see a return to production on the scale that we had before the war in the Persian Gulf. On the other hand, he said if this continues and there is the kind of destruction which we have threatened Iran with, we might not see a full return to production for anywhere from 5 to 10 years. But I think fertilizer is probably the single most important issue right now. The second one is diesel. And diesel is an enormous problem, particularly where you are, Stein. I'm sure you're familiar with the stringent requirements imposed by the EU on the production of diesel, such that you're very dependent on urea. And urea is another product that we are missing from the Persian Gulf right now. And people said, well, then use regular diesel, use a different form of diesel. The problem with that is that you've put catalytic converters into all of your trucks, and those catalytic converters will not operate with standard diesel. What does that do to Europe and the delivery of goods and services, particularly food, beverages? I think it's going to have a terrible impact. Those are the obvious ones. You have something else happening right now. You have China, for instance, that is essentially banning the export of petroleum products, banning the export of rare earths, banning the export of other specific commodities that the Chinese have decided they need to retain control of. We are trying to compensate to the extent that we're able by selling off a lot of our petroleum. So we have tankers that would normally tank up in the Persian Gulf that are headed to the Gulf of Mexico. I guess some people call it the Gulf of America. I still call it Gulf of Mexico. That means off the coast of Texas and all the way up to Louisiana, where you have massive refineries and storage of petroleum. The problem is we can't load it at the rate that is necessary. In other words, we cannot provide it in the quantity and at the pace that is needed right now for most of the world. And eventually, I predict that we will ration it here at home. There will be a decision, much like the Chinese have made, to stop exporting it. People think that's impossible. It's not impossible. We may have to ration a lot of things, not the least of which, of course, is food. We just don't know where we're going to be in another 2, 3, 4 months. It depends on what happens over the next few days. That's a quick snapshot. The energy complex, you can't look at aluminum. Even copper is going to be affected by this, and copper is in short supply. Uranium, the byproducts of refining. All these things are going to come together in an unfortunate impact on the world. It's going to affect us. It's going to affect Europe in particular. Now, having said all of that, what's the next item? The next item is the petrodollar. Now, I think most Europeans are familiar with the petrodollar. They may not understand how the system has worked, certainly since the 1970s, when we came off the gold standard and we started insisting that dollars be utilized for all transactions involving energy, oil in particular. And that was agreed to by the Saudis and, of course, all the Emirates in the Gulf. And effectively, everybody went along with it. That was a wonderful development for us because it allowed people that were doing business in dollars to recycle those dollars back into the American economy. They bought treasuries, they bought bonds. Well, that's not going to happen anymore because increasingly people are moving away from the dollar. Why de-dollarization? Well, because we've threatened everybody. We've threatened everybody by weaponizing the dollar. That's one of the reasons that the Russians and the Chinese have tried to move away from SWIFT and have moved into a new system whose name I can't pronounce that the Chinese have developed. But the new system is very good, by the way. It's very efficient. It's very rapid. Everybody who's using it says so. But the point is that's going to hurt us at home. The destruction of the petrodollar is going to undermine our standard of living. Now, the third thing I want to mention before we go into any detail about the forthcoming war fighting, which is almost upon us, is a little bit about Donald Trump. People all the time ask the question, what is the strategy? Well, there is no strategy. What we've had is essentially demands from Israel and its agents in the United States, the Zionist billionaire class. Sometimes we call them the Epstein class, but they're Zionist billionaires. And these people have said, we want war with Iran. And I think one of the things that President Trump did in order to be reelected was he promised those billionaires that he would deliver a war against Iran. Having watched him in action now for the last 12, 13, 14 months, it's hard to reach any other conclusion. Contrary to whatever may be said, we have no national strategic interest that benefits from war with Iran. None. So what are we doing? We are demanding that Iran meet Israeli demands. What are Israel's demands? Well, ultimately, Israel has this Greater Israel project. It wants to establish the Jewish state as the supreme power in the region. In other words, effectively, Jewish-Israeli supremacy. They've identified, at least for the moment, that Iran is the one state that stands in their way, that everyone else has either been bought off or beaten into submission. Therefore, Iran must go. It must be destroyed. Its power must be destroyed. So the number one demand they made was no enrichment of uranium. Now, Iran has not, and as far as I know, still hasn't, built a nuclear weapon, and has made it very clear it doesn't want to. But that hasn't made any difference because they've been I'm talking about the Jewish state and the agents in the United States. They've been insisting that virtually every year, month after month, Iran is within 2 weeks of a nuclear weapon. Iran is within days of a nuclear weapon. Iran is within hours. And oh my goodness, if they get that, they will immediately launch nuclear weapons at everybody, the United States and anybody else they don't like. There's no evidence for any of that. But if you say things long enough, people unfortunately have a habit of believing them. And the people in the United States who believe that nonsense are boomers, people of my generation. They are the ones that believe it. People younger than me, people down in their 40s and 30s don't buy it for a second. But that's been the president's argument. Now, President Trump has said, you've got to give up enrichment, period. The Iranians have said that's a matter of sovereignty for us. We're not going to go along with that. Secondly, you've got to cut way back on your arsenal of ballistic missiles, specifically any long range. And from the standpoint of Israel, anything that can reach Israel is long range, ergo, it must be eliminated. So if you're an Iranian, that means you have to live under the constant threat of Israeli attack and you have no means of deterring it and protecting yourself. So that's off the table. Absolute impossibility. Then the last demand that the Israelis have made is that the Iranians cannot cooperate with their co-religionists, their friends in the region, whoever they may be. In other words, Iran must live in splendid isolation from everyone in the region and obey the diktat of Israel. Well, that's unacceptable. So where are we going to go? We're going to hold talks on Thursday. The two representatives from the United States will include Mr. Kushner and Mr. Witkoff, both of whom are widely regarded as Israeli agents or assets. So the expectation is that these talks will go nowhere. That means the war begins again when the ceasefire ends, and that is supposed to end sometime on Monday. Now, could it end earlier? Yes, depending upon what happens at sea, and that's another dimension of this complex problem. We are now trying to blockade the Persian Gulf and essentially the Iranian coast. It hasn't turned out to be as easy as everyone had hoped because Iran has created this, I would say, 500 to 1,000 mile zone all the way around its borders that can be turned instantly into a killing zone because of persistent surveillance from outer space. In other words, space-based surveillance. There are links from these Chinese and Russian satellites straight down to the strike systems that Iran has built and established on the ground. These strike systems can be any number of different kinds of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and also unmanned systems, or what people call drones. Within that sort of 500 to 1,000 mile range, if you could be seen, you could be targeted. If you could be targeted, you could be killed. You can't move in and out of it with impunity, day or night. This is an enormous problem for the United States Armed Forces, because unless they are willing to risk war with China and Russia by attacking their satellites with missiles launched from aircraft at high altitude, which could be done, you're stuck. You can't defeat it. You can't jam it effectively. You can't stop it. So this means that before we go into this next round, we have to take this into account. And that means you have to move the fleet away from the danger area. And if you're planning on using ground forces, and we seem to be bringing more into the region, that seems to be on the agenda, that's going to have to be done very carefully. I think this brings us to what's next. And I think what's next is a massive air and missile campaign that begins sometime on Monday that is designed to destroy the Iranian state and cause the disintegration of the Iranian society. That's what you're talking about. You're not talking about, we want to get the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. We want to destroy the leadership. We want to make life tough on the population. No, we want to destroy Iran. This is catastrophic in my view, because it won't work. It's not going to work because many of the losses that the Iranians have sustained, they've made good on. It's not just the United States and its armed forces that are replenishing, rearming, refurbishing, and preparing for the next round. The Iranians have done the same thing. And the Chinese have brought in additional missiles and radars and equipment they need. The Russians have shown up with lots of humanitarian aid, but they've also shown up with other technologies that are essential for the success of an integrated air defense. There is actually the very real possibility that this time around, the air defense network will work infinitely better than it has in the past. That is for Iran. Now, how many missiles do they have left? I've seen different estimates. One is 45 to 50,000 unmanned systems or drones that can be launched from anywhere in Iran against targets within the range that I mentioned to you before. They are intact, they're ready to go, and they can actually manufacture more underground. Then you have missiles, and we think somewhere between 15 and 20,000 ballistic missiles and cruise missiles remain. All of these, once again, can reach any targets inside those areas. And then there is now an air defense network that didn't work very well until nearly the end of the last air and missile campaign. And now I think will work a little bit better, with the result that we will be unable to penetrate the airspace everywhere over Iran with impunity. It's going to be tougher. This places a huge premium on the weapons you use. You want joint air to surface missiles, JASSMs. We expended 1,000 of them during the first air and missile campaign. I don't know how many more we have to shoot. Then we have, of course, the PAC-3 missile, the theater high altitude missiles. These are the ones that are designed to shoot down incoming missiles. No doubt we have shipped whatever we can afford to the Israelis to try and do a better job of protecting Israel at this point. I don't think we are going to be able to replace all of the radars. Many of those radars, particularly the THAAD radars, theater high altitude air defense radars, were 500 million a pop. We don't have a warehouse full of those things. So I think our ability to provide early warning effectively across the region is not going to be very good. And that, of course, is a problem, because if you don't know it's coming until you're, say, a minute away from the impact or 2 minutes away, you need to get out of wherever you are and run like hell to find a shelter. That's going to be tough, and that's going to make it much harder for operations. So that's kind of the balance of where we are. Now, we do have more ground troops coming, and I suppose there will be an attempt to seize some islands in the Persian Gulf. That's going to be very tough, because how do you get close enough to these islands without being detected? And where would you go? From what would you launch? And I think we've seen evidence right now that both the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait are areas from which we will try to launch these missiles. Now, in the meantime, the Crown Prince from the United Arab Emirates is being in Beijing, and I assume that he's talking to the Chinese, asking them to bring some influence to bear on Iran to not utterly destroy the UAE. But the problem is, as long as the UAE continues to make their facilities available to us, that's probable. And this, I guess, brings us to the real problem. We are going to try to, quote unquote, bomb Iran into the Stone Age. Iran has made very clear that if you do that, they are going to counter by destroying all the installations for oil infrastructure and refining all up and down the coast. If we hit their salination plants, which I think is probably going to happen, there are salination plants, roughly 50, up and down the Gulf Coast on the west. They will be hit. If they strike Al Jabail, one of the biggest ports in Saudi Arabia, where you also have both a desalination plant as well as major oil infrastructure, that could be catastrophic for Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, you have the pipeline. And I've actually driven the pipeline in Saudi Arabia. I know exactly where it is. And we moved along this pipeline before we deployed north to attack into Iraq. And one of the things that you see, it's very vulnerable. It's very obvious. You can't camouflage it. You can't hide it. It's not underground. It would not take much to stop that, in which case Yanbo and Jeddah and other ports on the Red Sea that might otherwise be places where you could upload oil won't make much difference. And then, of course, we have to mention the Houthis, and we have to assume that they will join the fight. And that means that we will not be able to get into or out of the Red Sea without action, and the Suez Canal will be a problem. And we're back to the issue from the very beginning, which is, who is going to underwrite commercial shipping through the region? Nobody. Whether it's the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, doesn't matter. Everyone's going to say, forget it. If you're going there, we're not going to insure it. That means the global energy complex, if we proceed as I think we will on Monday, risks complete disaster. And you're talking about in the United States sliding into a deep recession right away. I think you'll see a global recession that could rapidly become a depression. Now, if you go to a place like Australia, they say in 13 days they will be completely out of diesel. They shut down their refineries. They went crazy with the environmentalists decided to shut those refineries down. So even though they have some petroleum on hand, they can't refine it. So Australia's in a lot of trouble. You have similar situations in many other countries. My point is, this is a disaster that will ensue and will last for years. It will be years before people recover. And the question is, who is going to risk going into the Gulf to repair any of this? And if they do, what sort of agreements have to be reached between Iran and its neighbors in the Arabian Peninsula? And I think those agreements will result in our permanent expulsion, we, the United States, from the region. Now, how do you stop all this? Well, if you're Donald Trump, you pick up the phone and you call Mr. Netanyahu and say, I've gone as far as I can. I can't go any further. This has to stop. Will he do that? I see no evidence that he will do that. In fact, I see a lot of evidence that we're busy trying to make Mr. Netanyahu happy. And there is a fear that if you don't make him adequately happy, you, as the President of the United States, could be removed or worse. So this brings me back to who is this man, Donald Trump, and how does he think and how does he live? And I think you've got to go back to a man named Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was a very famous man, famous for his vindictiveness, famous for his intelligence, and famous for his, let us say, demonic tendencies. He seems to have been the mentor for Donald Trump for many years in New York City. He had 3 rules for life. Rule number 1 was attack, attack, attack. Rule number 2 was deny, deny, deny. And rule number 3 was whatever happens, declare victory. You're a hero. You were successful. You won. Those were Roy Cohn's rules, and I think those rules were internalized by Donald Trump. If you sort through his book, The Art of the Deal, you'll see plenty of evidence for it. The man is a marketing genius, and he stops at nothing to persuade you that he is winning and things are great. And he will lie until, the cows come home, if necessary, to make you feel that way. This is what people in marketing do. They don't tell you the truth. And when the truth is ugly, only a lie can be beautiful. And right now, the truth in the Gulf is ugly. The notion that the United States Navy can sail with impunity through the Strait of Hormuz, declare victory, and say, hello, we're here, we control it, is absurd. And I'm sure Admiral Cooper, who is the commander of Central Command, knows that. Last point, and then I'll shut up, and you can think about what you want to discuss next. If you don't own gold, if you don't own silver, you better buy, and you better get it quick. Because if I'm right, gold will go way up to $6,000 an ounce. So it's not going to sit where it is. The slight pullback in gold is just that, a slight pullback. Wait for the stock market to crash, because if this takes off the way I think it will, that market will eventually catch up with reality. Right now, there's a disconnect between what I would say is paper reality and physical reality. Physical reality always wins. At the moment, Wall Street is consumed with paper reality. But I'm telling everybody, and whenever I speak, I tell people this, I might feel like a broken record, but I also listen very carefully to Rick Rule, whom I respect immensely, and he tells you the same thing. Get into the hard assets and stay in cash. Now, that doesn't mean that the cash is always going to be perpetually valuable, because we face another problem. It's called inflation. Wars breed inflation. That's why you don't fight the damn things unless you're compelled to do so. And inflation in this country, in the United States, is rising. And I think we're going to see that elsewhere as a result of this war. All of these things mean hard times. So you got to get ready for it. The good news is for us in North America, if the Canadians and the Americans can get together and put their heads together, we can avoid a lot of misery in the future if we focus on investing in the right things. We can be largely independent of the world in all the areas that I've mentioned. That's what Americans and Canadians, I think, know, but they don't know how little their respective governments have invested intelligently to make that possible. That will now have to happen. And when the rationing starts, the prosperity dies, the standard of living falls, people are going to say, wait a minute, why don't we have X number of refineries? Why can't we refine our own rare earths? Why aren't we mining more than we are mining today? Why aren't we capturing copper from vast quantities of cast-off metal? Why are we not mining more uranium? I mean, we just go down the list. They're going to say, wait a minute, what's this? And what are we doing with our oil resources? What are we doing to further exploit it? All of that's coming. But it's a shame that it has to happen this way, because a little strategic planning with an eye on more than the next quarter's earnings could have helped us a great deal, but that's not our nature.